Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to see me. This is my first time at JFocus, and I haven't been to Stockholm in a really long time, so I'm super excited to be here. And after I'm done with this talk, I hope that you kind of sit and stew on it for a while. This is something that I want you to kind of like think about and talk about with the people you work with. This is especially important if you're in a management position or some kind of like senior engineering role. And if you're in the room and you're new, you're a young developer, or you're new to the concept of DevOps in general, there are people that want to make this easier for you, I promise. So let's go. First of all, my name is Kat Cosgrove, and I'm a staff developer advocate at Pulumi. But before I was a developer advocate, I was kind of all over the place. I did work as an engineer for a while at JFrog, actually, in embedded Linux development, which is very different from DevOps. And I was fresh out of a boot camp at the time when I got that job, so it was kind of a rough adjustment. I was thrust very quickly into an extremely fast-paced environment where I not only had to learn a whole bunch of new tools and methodologies, but I had to apply them to an area that traditionally isn't very DevOps-y. There just isn't all that much DevOps involved in embedded Linux development anymore, and there certainly wasn't 4 years ago. We were just kind of trying to like wrap our heads around the idea of how to do that. I had freelanced as a developer before, but I was doing like building Joomla sites and stuff for people, so I was like way out of my depth, like extremely out of my depth. I don't know why they took a chance on me. But they did, and we did a good job. But before I go any further, I promise that anecdote is relevant. If you would like to get a hold of me later, my Twitter handle is Dixie3Flatline. My slides for this talk will be up sometime tonight at pulumi.com/cat. And you can try emailing me at cat@pulumi.com, but I don't like super recommend making that attempt. I'm not the most reliable person in the world on replying to emails, and I think at least 1 or 2 people in this room can attest to that, so good luck. Anyway, when I was an embedded Linux engineer, we were building a proof of concept demonstrating that fast over-the-air updates for cars were possible. The software updates for most cars are manual, even today. Somebody in the room is probably thinking, oh, my Tesla, or oh, my BMW. And yes, Teslas can do it. Some BMWs can do it now. It's getting a little bit more common, but the overwhelming majority of cars, even like really expensive luxury cars like Jaguars, require an update at a physical service center. They just flash the computer, actually. It's not really an update, which kind of sucks. It takes hours. And we built a proof of concept that made that less sucky. Okay, you could do it in like 45 minutes or for like a full firmware update, seconds sometimes for just application updates. It was really cool. But I went from a web developer overnight to an embedded Linux developer that had to learn what embedded Linux is, first of all, and then I had to learn a little bit of electrical engineering because we were building like a physical analog for a real car. Of course, like our employer wasn't going to buy us a real car to potentially brick, right? And I had to learn all of these technologies on this slide really, really, really fast. And I never would have been able to do that if I didn't have a manager who believed in me and a tech lead who was an outstanding mentor. And I thought that that was normal at first. And then I talked to other people and realized that it's not. Not everybody gets that resource, and that is something that we need to fix. I easily could have failed here. I really easily could have failed here, but my team made sure I didn't, and that actually is their job, and I'll talk about it later. But none of this stuff was actually easy to learn, and that's not because I don't have a degree in computer science, or because I'm not smart enough, or because these things are all inherently difficult to learn no matter who you are. I know people say that about Kubernetes, that it's just inherently difficult. That's not true. We're bad at teaching it. We are getting better at that. But it's the way we talk about these things. So I want to make sure everybody is on the same page because there are whole conference talks on this, but this is the definition of DevOps I'm running with for this talk, okay? The union of the development team and the IT operations team through the use of a specific set of practices and tool chains with the ultimate goal of shortening the software development lifecycle and delivering more high-quality software. Can we all agree on that? It's easy enough? Cool. So in order for DevOps to work, we need tools and a cultural shift, right? It's not just stuff, and it's not just a methodology or like a team vibe or whatever. You have to have both for this thing to happen. It's an established fact. We love to yell DevOps is a methodology, not just a tool set, and like get kind of snarky on the internet about it. But it's still a topic of a lot of conference talks as more companies move over from the older ways of doing things to a more DevOps-y kind of thing. I'm not going to go into that a ton because, again, more qualified people than me have entire talks on the subject. But generally, for developers, DevOps may mean changing the way you write software, right? You have to write code that's a little bit more modular, so it's easier for other people to maintain it because that's more important than the compiler or the interpreter or your CI system being able to understand it. The next person who maintains it needs to be able to understand it. You need to merge with source multiple times a day and make sure that you're making much smaller changes. We all know this, right? But that's not actually obvious when you are first thrust into this, because we have so much like cultural knowledge and context from having done this and having personally experienced the ways in which things were difficult before that it's intuitive for us. It's not intuitive when you first try to do this. So that's like one small thing we have to do better. But developers should no longer exist in a silo, right? Everyone has to do DevOps to some degree for this to work. And it takes some getting used to. There's always some rough patches, but ultimately it's better for the whole team. It's better for the whole org. It's better for the users because they're getting more updates and fewer bugs, or if they do get a bug, we catch it faster now. So we should be motivated to make this easier for people to learn. The point I'm trying to make here is that an understanding of DevOps practices and tooling is not the exclusive domain of people with the word DevOps in their job title anymore. It's everyone who touches either side of this equation, or else it doesn't work at all. We don't even get there. It's not just DevOps engineers, it's not just SREs or release managers, it's not just whoever's handling your infra, it's everybody. And a lot of this stuff is pretty new in the grand scheme of things. DevOps as a term didn't even exist until a little bit more than a decade ago. So we're kind of taking that for granted a little. And then we get thrown some random curveballs where some things that we think of as very new because DevOps is so young, but they're old, like CI/CD. We've had the concept of continuous integration since the early 90s. It's not new, it's really old, but we think of it as shiny and new because we have a million words for the same things, and sometimes we change the definition of those things, which gets really hard to deal with. Like, just 4 years ago, for instance, Linkerd and the concept of a service mesh did not exist. We did not have that thing. But today, it's hard for some people to imagine operating without one. For some people, that's super, super important. It evolves really, really, really fast, technology in this space. Faster than we realize. You blink and you've got a new thing that feels like it's been an integral part of your development lifecycle for the whole time you've been doing this. That's wild. You know, we think cell phones evolve fast, but software is a whole new ballgame, especially when it's tools for developers. So that leads to the problem of expertise, right? We've got layers and layers of abstraction between us and our code now, right? We've got abstraction layers for abstraction layers. And a lot of us have been around here long enough to have seen why those earlier abstraction layers came to be. You viscerally understand how hard it used to be to push an update to your application 20 years ago, right? When it was reasonable and acceptable and normal to wait a year for a software update. Now, that's ridiculous, right? So we can intuitively grasp why something like a service mesh might be useful if you spend enough time working with like large-scale container orchestration, right? Other people can't do that. So we have to hold people's hands a little bit more than that. So I want to talk about how we can prevent this problem from getting worse and maybe make you understand a little bit specifically how weird it can get. But first, the scale of the problem we need to solve for. So these are numbers from the US because these were the easiest numbers for me to get a hold of. But in the US, about 65,000 people graduate from a 4-year program in computer science each year. That's just computer science, not to mention like computer engineering or EE or a 2-year degree. And if you add in coding bootcamp grads like, me, you get around another 23,000. That number is also rising. I don't have data for the number of self-educated engineers because that's self-reported, it's harder to get, but we're at almost 90,000 new junior developers a year. That is a lot of new talent and a lot of new ideas, and we want those things, right? We want their help. Sometimes fresh eyes have a perspective that you can't, even with decades of experience. Sometimes a seemingly stupid question from somebody who doesn't know what they're doing is inspirational. It touches on something that you can't see anymore because you're an expert and you already understand this concept, right? According to data from CompTIA, last year in the US, there were 307,000 new tech jobs. 123,000 of them were in Washington State, which is where I live. And that does include a variety of roles and seniority levels, but still, that is a huge number of open positions that we are not filling. That kind of feels like a problem. Now, I don't know what all of these new grads are good at. You don't either. I don't know what they like. But we do mostly agree that DevOps is a full spectrum thing. It's all or nothing if it's going to work. So every one of these 90,000 new grads needs to understand what we're doing. And they need to, most importantly, they need to understand why. If they do not have the context for why we do these things, they're never going to fully grasp it. And we're not actually making it easy for them. Whether we realize what we're doing or not, it's kind of gatekeeping. It's unintentional, and we're not being malicious about it, right? But it is technically gatekeeping. Let's talk about it. So gatekeeping is the act of preventing access to something like a career, a community, or a fandom unless specific and usually unreasonable, like really unreasonable, requirements get met. So for example, consider somebody, me, for instance, going to a card store to play Magic the Gathering, right? On a Friday night. If you don't know what Magic the Gathering is, it's a competitive trading card game. It's been around since the early 90s. And instead of just letting me hang out and play, as you would expect, somebody might ask me to name the winning deck from every Magic the Gathering World Championship since 1994. That is an absurd requirement, so it's gatekeeping. Or if you go up to somebody and they're wearing a t-shirt for your favorite band and you ask them to name every one of their albums and what's their favorite album, and then you judge them harshly based on their favorite album because it's one of the newer ones and their old stuff is better, that's gatekeeping. But this is intentional, right? And it's malicious. I submit that there's a second type of gatekeeping, and it's what we're doing. So if intentional gatekeeping is when you take a real action, like you make a decision to do something to force a newbie to prove themselves, we are also looking at an unintentional option where you accomplish the same thing, but you aren't making a choice to do it. You set some weird standard that is not really reasonable for a large class of people to reach and prevent them from gaining access that way. Like requiring, I don't know, for a junior DevOps role, requiring 4 years of experience. It's a junior role, okay? It's a junior role. They're never gonna have 4 years of experience, but you see that all the time in engineering. It's not unusual at all to see a junior role that requires multiple years of experience. How are they supposed to get it, right? How is a junior developer supposed to already be a Kubernetes expert, right? It's gatekeeping. But I think we're doing this in some more difficult to notice at first ways. Jargon, we have a lot of it. Bad documentation, a lack of mentorship, and weird hiring practices. I'm going to start with my personal pet peeve, which is jargon and the persistent assumption that everybody reading our content has been around since the dawn of time and understands exactly every piece of like weird code word we might use. To do this, I'm going to present you with 2 pieces of jargon for things that the majority of you are not experts in. So, fencing. Fencing is an Olympic sport with 3 different styles, all of them with different rules: foil, épée, and saber. There may be at least 1 or 2 fencers in the room right now, so you might get the next question right. But it's an actual sport, it's not a martial art, it's been around for a very long time, you've probably seen it at the Olympics, and regardless of which weapon you fence, the definition of the attack is always the same. And people who don't fence are almost never able to correctly define it for me. So take a moment and guess what you think an attack is in fencing. No, but I am going to give you the definition. So you might think that an attack is any action intended to score a touch or a point against your opponent. And that's actually not correct. The attack is the initial offensive action made by extending the arm and continuously threatening the opponent's target preceding the launch of a lunge or flesh. On the surface, that does kind of make sense. Like most of y'all knowing almost nothing about fencing probably other than watching it at the Olympics, this kind of makes sense to you, right? The words go together. It sounds like it's about fencing. You understand that it's the first offensive action somebody takes, not the second or third. We have different words for those. If they're sticking their arm out and aggressively threatening the opponent before lunging, you know what a lunge is, and then what's a flesh, right? So you can guess what a lunge is. I'm sure you know, but flesh, random French word right in the middle here. We've got jargon in the definition of the jargon. But in this case, it's not actually a huge problem, right? Because fencing has been around for a really long time, and fencers know what a flesh is. You learn what a flesh is within your first couple lessons, right? It's a basic movement in fencing. It's a basic piece of footwork. So this actually isn't a huge problem. It's one Google search, even for somebody who doesn't know anything about fencing. And fencing gets away with this because in a lot of cases, the language used to describe the sport hasn't changed in a century or longer. That's not true for us. Our technology changes every 6 months. It changes annually. Again, we didn't have service meshes like 4 or 5 years ago, and now it's a whole thing, right? So we can't get away with that the way fencing does. Just like I can't expect you to get away with this next one, which maybe one person in the audience will get, but I doubt it. So does anybody know what goats means in the context of video games? We got 2 back there? Sick. All right. Thank you. I am always excited to have somebody in the audience who will understand this example because it's like a weird story. Anyway, so Overwatch is a first-person shooter by Blizzard Entertainment, and it has a robust competitive scene. It has for a few years now. And in Overwatch, the term GOATs refers to a specific composition of heroes playable in the game, originally consisting of 3 tanks, heroes with lots of health but who don't do a lot of damage and may move slowly, and 3 healers with no dedicated damage-dealing characters. The origin of this specific piece of jargon is actually pretty weird, though. You might guess that it stands for greatest of all time. GOAT is a really common sports term, right? Somebody who is incredible at whatever sport they play would be referred to as a GOAT. That's not correct. It actually refers to the name of a team by the same name who first popularized this competition and made a run through the bracket of Overwatch contenders, Blizzard's semi-professional league, 4 years ago. Okay, it was unstoppable at the time, by the way, like absolutely ran everybody through, and this was like all we played professionally for like a year, maybe a year and a half, really. It was crazy. Now, this is not a user-friendly piece of jargon, okay? There's like lore involved in this jargon. You can't just, there's no way you can intuit what this means and where it comes from. If somebody says, let's go goats, when you're playing Overwatch and you aren't like ancient, you haven't been playing it since launch like I have, you're not gonna know what somebody says when they ask you, let's go goats, right? You're gonna have to go Google that, and you're certainly not gonna understand why it's called that. That's confusing, okay? So Blizzard didn't like that, and they handled it thusly. They wanted to expand viewership of Overwatch League, the pro league, to like they had streaming partnerships with ESPN and Disney, which was pretty neat, but they had to do away with this term because it's not user-friendly. It alienates people. It's gatekeeping. The shoutcasters can't say goats. The audience doesn't know what that means because they are mostly casual players, right? Or just, they don't even play. They're just viewers. So why use a term like this that's so hostile towards newbies? So they told the shoutcasters to call this composition 3-3 instead, which makes a lot more sense because it's 3 tanks and 3 healers, just right there on the tin. And now all of the viewers don't need a whole bunch of lore about semi-professional Overwatch competitions from 4 years ago to understand what it means when somebody says, let's go goats. That one is weird, and that's closer to what we're doing. So mainstream esports is in its infancy. It's very, very young, right? And it feels like we get a new piece of slang or jargon once a month. But it's easy for me to pick it up because I've been around for a super long time and I have all of that context. If somebody throws a new piece of like weird esports jargon at me, I can figure that out. Just like it's easier for people with a decade of DevOps experience to figure out like what a service mesh is and why it's useful, right? Not so much for folks trying to get into watching esports casually or folks who are brand new to software engineering and DevOps in general. It's unfair. The term was a barrier to entry and it didn't need to be there, so Blizzard got rid of it. Same goes for DevOps. Okay, if we want people to use our tools and move towards a more DevOps way of doing things, we have to clearly define the domain-specific language we use. We just do. We have to make this involve fewer hurdles. It's not helpful for us or for them to keep using words that don't really make sense, that make our technology feel less approachable, that make us feel less approachable, right? An experienced engineer moving over from a completely unrelated field to yours or trying your tool for the first time or whatever should also still be considered a newbie. So if we put in just like a tiny bit more work to define the jargon we use when we use it and do away with things that don't make sense on the surface, then we make our products and our ways of doing things way more approachable. Especially if you're like me and you have to justify your salary to the marketing department. So this is especially true when it comes to your technical documentation. Please have a quick start guide, a useful one, a useful quick start guide that includes a practical functional example of something that your user might actually want to start with. A little bit more than a hello world here. Hello world is good for seeing that the tool actually operates, that it does something, but it doesn't give you any insight into the actual like usability of this thing or how one might go about getting started. All you've given people, if you just have a little hello world, is here's how you like run it. You're not actually letting them do anything with it, right? You also need to provide the why for each thing. Don't just tell me that your product facilitates service-to-service communications between microservices using a sidecar proxy. I don't know what that means, okay? I do, but a ton of people reading your documentation don't. That's too much. You're doing too much. Tell me why this thing is useful in practical terms. Give me an example. What problem specifically are you solving? Make it visceral, right? Linkerd is actually particularly good at this. Their docs even include links out to explanations of relevant concepts and terms that get mentioned like incidentally in their docs. It's incredible. There's a step-by-step guide as well. It's pretty great. And every single command that you have to run is explained in painstaking detail. Like, really huge shout out to Linkerd's technical writers. My only complaint there is they use the word easy in a technical context, and that's bad. It's gatekeeping, and here's why. Easy is actually a super alienating term in technical documentation. Okay, in marketing copy for your product, go for it. Go for it. Developers aren't reading that anyway. I'm not reading it. Nobody is reading that except for, the C-suite decision makers, other marketing folk. The devs are not reading that. But you can't use the word easy in your technical documentation. You just can't. If you do, you need to be damn sure that it's actually easy, like really easy. Okay? Not just easy for you, easy for everyone, and it almost certainly isn't. If this new talent that we want to be using our stuff doesn't find it easy when your docs repeatedly say it is, they're going to be discouraged. And I don't need to be struggling on the daily any more than I already am, right? The reality is that none of this stuff is actually easy. It isn't, until you're an expert. And then by the time you're an expert, you've kind of forgotten what it's like to not be an expert. So call something easy when it's not for an absolute beginner, and that's kind of gatekeeping again. And you might be thinking, I've heard this literal argument before. Kat, it was hard for me. These things are just difficult to learn. It's normal. That's just the way it is. And to that I say, why? Like, why does it have to be that way? Like, there's no glory involved in stuff being hard just for the sake of being hard. We're all here to do a job, build a thing, maybe improve some lives, get paid, okay? That's what we're here for, and that doesn't have to be hard. It really, there's no reason to keep it difficult, Please. So until DevOps trade schools and boot camps become a thing, or universities start teaching these technologies too, which is going to take a very long time, they're really slow to turn over new curricula, we have to take teaching this stuff into our own hands, okay? There's 90,000 new grads a year, and they need our help, and we need their help because we want to take advantage of their fresh brains and fresh eyes and their weird ideas, right? So some people already do this. Developer advocates do this. We get paid to do this. And there are a bunch of great books out there. There are a lot of people teaching workshops and selling courses on like Udemy or whatever, a ton of content creators writing stuff on sites like dev.to, more YouTube personalities than I know what to do with, but we need more help than that. We need this to happen internally at y'all's companies. So if you have the energy for it, maybe find somebody to mentor. It doesn't have to be a complete stranger. It can be a junior from another team at work, or it can be a stranger. You can find somebody on Twitter, or every coding boot camp on the planet has students that always want a mentor. And it can be time consuming. It very much can be, and it can be very emotionally draining because being new in this industry is really hard, and you will have to deal with some of that, but we need the help, and we need people who are willing to let people ask seemingly stupid questions without making them feel like it's a stupid question, right? We have all asked a stupid question before, every last one of us. I will ask a stupid question later today, probably. And part of being a good engineer as you grow is not being afraid to ask a potentially stupid question. So maybe let's teach them that early. But we need people in positions of power and people with experience and people with authority to help instill that in them before it's too late. And specifically, I'm talking to the seniors and team leads in the room. If you let your junior teammates struggle more than is absolutely necessary, and I mean longer than like 30 minutes, an hour, not only are you being a crappy teammate, but you are actively detrimental to your organization. you are wasting time, and DevOps is about reducing time wasted. Also, as a senior, one of your responsibilities is to mentor your junior teammates. It is literally part of your job to make sure that your junior teammates are learning and growing as engineers. Suffering is absolutely not a rite of passage here. You can't just sit there and let them struggle just because you did. Give them a hand. Okay, this is leading into something ugly. So you are not going to get a junior DevOps engineer with 5 years of experience with Kubernetes, Istio, Artifactory, Golang, Helm, Jenkins, Hyper-V, Perl, and Azure. Just Azure, not even a specific tool, just Azure generally, right? First of all, that is more than one senior engineer. And second of all, mastery in all of those things is a ridiculous requirement. And you might think I'm exaggerating here, but I was not. Okay, I combed through a bunch of job postings writing this talk, job postings in Seattle specifically, and some of these were absolutely wild for a junior title, like completely out of pocket. This is a screenshot of a job listing I took a few months ago with a title of Junior DevOps Engineer. Junior. Okay, this was in the first page of results on Indeed.com, which is a really huge job site in the US. I did not have to look hard to find this. And reading all of those, like, I wonder if anyone actually knows what it means to be a junior anymore. I would not qualify for this, okay? Lots of people I know wouldn't, lots of people y'all look up to would not qualify for this. It's a truly outrageous. So imagine how this looks to an actual junior, okay? We can look at this and realize, no, this is ridiculous. This is somebody who like doesn't actually know anything about the role. This is like a non-technical manager wrote this, or like a recruiter wrote this without knowing much about the role. And we kind of know that this is mostly, bullcrap, right? But we only know that because we have experience. If somebody with no experience looks at this, they're going to go, wow, I'm not even qualified for a junior role in this industry. Why bother? Because that's super discouraging. And you can advise people to just apply to everything like all you want, but we all know that a piece of software is filtering out a ton of these resumes just for missing the wrong keywords before they even hit a real person's desk. Like just applying to whatever on every random job site hasn't been an effective strategy in years. So this kind of thing is also gatekeeping, whether it was an intentional attempt to underpay someone with more experience, which I doubt, or it was ignorance, which is what I'm betting on, because this is just like, this is a little bit ridiculous. I think this is just somebody didn't know what they were doing, but still, the effect is the same, and the impact of something like this matters more than your intent. Consider instead, I realize this is hard to look at, and that is the point. You don't need to be able to see any of these individual icons or know what it is. This is the landscape for, this is the Cloud Native Computing Foundation landscape as of 2020. And it's kind of ridiculous, right? It's so outrageously large at this point that unless your job requirements are extremely narrow, anyone you hire is going to have to learn some new stuff, okay? Anybody. That's a lot. It's truly a lot. So instead of trying to hire juniors who already know everything they need to know to do the job on day one, because that's not a junior, juniors have to spend time learning, consider instead focusing first on hiring seniors and tech leads who have the core skills and technologies you want, but also the ability and the drive to be good mentors. Get them onboarded really well. Developer onboarding is another thing I could write a whole talk about. And then hire juniors based on how well they learn, not what they know out of the box. You're never going to get somebody with enough of these tools under their belt as somebody early in their career to be useful on day one. It's just not going to happen because nobody gets a degree in DevOps. We don't teach this in college yet. We're all learning as we go here. Every last one of us had to learn this as we went. And maybe we're the most learn as you go because we're the experts now, right? We're way more likely to try something new immediately. We're more likely to be early adopters. We're more used to it. They're not. So each of the things I have talked about here, the rampant use of jargon, documentation written like the user is already an expert, a lack of mentorship, and unrealistic hiring practices prevents us from getting effective access to at least the 90,000 new grads in the US alone each year. And it prevents us from making the best of those that we do have. I'm sure, have all still read a piece of technical documentation and like the words go together, but you think, am I stupid? Right? Like, I'm sure that still happens to y'all. It still happens to me where I just like, I don't get it. It's so dry. There's so much jargon. There's no like practical how-to guide. Like, I don't know what this means. And like individually, each of these problems is just a barrier, right? But together they can be catastrophic. Okay? This is a cultural problem within DevOps that we need to get ahead of. Okay? If we want to live up to our goals of delivering higher quality software faster and better, then we need to be better at talking to each other and better at talking to our juniors and better at teaching people how to use our tools. We can't claim to be a culture of collaboration and caring and cooperation if we're excluding anyone or forcing them to jump through a bunch of hoops to participate. And hoops includes keeping 40 Google tabs open because there are so many pieces of shorthand and weird jargon in your like tutorial on your blog. DevOps exists so that we don't have to suffer through the same problems with writing and delivering software that we did before, okay? Every new tool, every new technique, every new strategy, it just exists to solve a pain point. So why are we allowing these problems with our culture to continue? A lot of these are endemic to just like engineering in general, but it's especially obnoxious in DevOps when our goal is supposed to be making all of this easier, right? So why do we ignore this? We solve the problems with the software, with the concept of software development, but we're leaving the people problems alone. And that kind of sucks. As long as this kind of gatekeeping exists, we don't get to screech DevOps is a culture, not just a tool set, when somebody thinks CI/CD means DevOps without being hypocrites. And I know we all love screeching that. So here is what I'm asking from each of you today. I would like you to try to remember what it was like for you when you were new yourself, okay? And it might be difficult. Like, humans are really good at forgetting these things. We're really good at forgetting painful or difficult things. But I want you to try to think about specifically what you struggled with. In what ways did you have a hard time learning something, or whether it was a specific tool or learning how to ask a question? Because that is a skill, learning how to ask a question. It requires a lot of psychological safety at work to feel like you can ask a question without being potentially mocked for it, right? So think about what you struggled with, think about the way that felt, and think about how long it took you to feel like an expert in anything at all. Not for other people to consider you an expert, for you to feel like it, because those are two different timelines, I find, generally. Think about the people around you, like how they treated you, whether they helped you or not, and if they did, in what way. And then I want you to use that to change the way you speak and the way you write code and the way you write documentation and the way you work and the way you hire for the better, please. So thank you for coming to my talk. And also thank you to JFocus for having me. It's a lovely city. And all of the sponsors that helped this event happen. I think there's quite a lot of them on the website. I have time for some questions, but if I run out, you can always get a hold of me on Twitter at Dixie3Flatline. Thank you. In the back.
How to go from
Yeah.
Everyone agrees. Everyone wants things to be better, onboarding to be better. But how do you actually implement that?
Okay, so the question for the stream was how to go from like goodwill to actual change. The way I have handled this internally at more than one company is by volunteering to write like the documentation for something like this process myself. So at Pulumi, for instance, I thought we needed a glossary of terms. Pulumi is an infrastructure as code company, and we frequently use a term called cloud engineering, which is very new, and it's maybe a buzzword. I'm not really sure yet, but we use a ton of jargon. And I screeched about that a lot for a while and didn't get anywhere. So eventually I was like, you know what, okay, I'll just do it. What if I do it, okay? What if I just document this for us? Then can we please publish it on the website? And that made it happen. The same goes with our developer onboarding. I was one of the first people to be onboarded onto my team. And while I was being onboarded, I took notes of everywhere that I thought something was unclear or too difficult, or where something like needed to be added to a certain place. And after I was onboarded, I went to my manager with all of these notes and said, hey, I would just like to go fix this in the onboarding. And they will just let you do that, it turns out, a lot of the times. If you just like volunteer or rope some other people in to help you who are willing to like actually put in the work, they'll do it. Ideally, though, your manager just gets buy-in from your grand boss. But if that doesn't fly, yeah, you kind of gotta do some of the work yourself, unfortunately. Any more questions?
So in the context of hiring, how would you combat we must hire a senior engineer because all of this DevOps tech is really, really difficult?
The question was, in the context of hiring, how do you combat the issue of we need to hire a senior because of all of the DevOps tech is really, really difficult? Senior engineers who have all of the tools and skills that I think companies like this generally want and enough experience for them to be happy are really expensive, right? They're just like outrageously expensive. And I don't think that that doesn't mean that you should just like hire a bunch of juniors and YOLO it, right? That's not true. There is absolutely a balance, but you can't afford the engineer that is going to do everything you want to do, especially if you're like a little startup. You can't afford it. So I think a better balance is always to have like a couple of senior or higher engineers and then juniors to go with them that they are specifically willing to mentor. Like it's a conversation that has to be had with the seniors, I think. You have to be like, are you willing, are you able, do you have the time, do you have the interest to mentor somebody? And then you get you a junior that has some experience, like some portfolio projects, they've tried it with a couple of the technologies that you want, or they are able to prove that they can learn something in the interview. I don't like coding interviews, I don't do them, and I don't advise anyone do them, but like a take-home exercise where it's, hey, here's this technology we use, you've never heard of it before, but I want you to go through this like quick start example and see if you can spin it up for me, and then come back in 2 hours and talk to me about it. That's a good way to assess a junior's ability to learn and do the things that you want, in my opinion. It does rely on you giving them like a tool that has good documentation, but I think that's a good way to get around the proving a junior can do the job thing without giving them a dumb whiteboarding interview that's not relevant to DevOps anyway. Anybody else? Okay. Thanks, y'all.